that was weak. Good evening. That was much better. Thank you. Hope you've had a good Sunday afternoon, except for those who were pulling for the Miami Dolphins. That was not a very good afternoon for them, but everybody has to lose some time, except that last team that's left standing on Super Bowl Sunday, and they'll have to lose sometime next year, right? But they all have to lose sometime. But anyway, do hope you've had a good Sunday afternoon and are ready to learn a little bit about how to face discouragement and difficulty. You ever had that moment in your life, or maybe moments, maybe it's happened multiple times with you, where you just said something sort of like, I just don't know how much more I can take. Sometimes we feel like we've reached the end of the rope and the rope is frayed and the knot is gone and we're just hanging on by a thread. And we think that I cannot hold on much longer. You know, the amazing thing about Nehemiah is that there's nothing that would lead us to believe that he ever became despondent and discouraged, even though he had every right to. Because he has been back at it now for about a month and a half, and he has faced nothing but opposition. I mean, everywhere he turns, there are those who are opposing him. And in the passage we're going to look at tonight, it's going to reach its head with him because there are those who are making all these accusations against him and telling all of these fabrications about him and demanding that he meet them on their terms, and Nehemiah will not sway, he will not break. And we wonder sometimes how he was able to accomplish that. Because from the very beginning, after God has dispatched him and the king has given him permission to go back to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding the walls, he has faced nothing but opposition from every side, and it has grown more and more and more intense as time passes. And it comes to a head, as I said, here in chapter 6. And Nehemiah has to face it down, turn it away, and continue to be about the Lord's business. So the question is, how did he accomplish that? I mean, faced with all the difficulties and the opposition that he was faced with, how did he handle it and stand true to the task at hand? So that's what we want to think about for our time together this evening. We're going to read Nehemiah chapter 6 in its entirety, chapter 6 verses 1 through 19. So read along with me if you will. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, and that there were no breaks left in it, though at that time I had not hung the doors in the gates, that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me harm. So I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? But they sent me this message 4 times, and I answered them in the same manner. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me as before, the 5th time, with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. And you have also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying, There is a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king, so come, therefore, and let us consult together. Then I sent to him, saying, No such things as you say are being done, but you invent them in your own heart. For they were trying to make us afraid, saying, Their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Now, therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. Afterward I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Deliah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informer, and he said to me, Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you. And I said, Should such a man as I flee? Who is there such as I who would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. Then I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this reason he was hired, that I should be afraid and act that way in sin, so that they might have cause for an evil report, that they might reproach me. My God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul, in the 22nd days, in 52 days, And it happened when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God. Also in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came to them. For many in Judah were pledged to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Era, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. Also they reported his good deeds before me, and reported my words to him. Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. Father, thank you for the example of this man Nehemiah. He was such a strong man of God, who would not be swayed by the threats of his enemies, and who continued steadfastly in the work that you had assigned him, doing this tremendous work and accomplishing this tremendous task in but 52 days. Father, I pray that we might learn lessons from the example of Nehemiah tonight, for those times in our lives when we feel like we've reached the end of the rope and we've done all that we can do, and even maybe even in our spirits we're crying out, how much more could I possibly take? Help us to learn lessons that would be applicable to our own lives, that would strengthen us and enable us to face those same days of difficulty. We pray this in the matchless name of our Savior Jesus Christ. We ask it for his sake. Amen. Now, just for a moment, let's recap. Nehemiah has heard word, back over in chapter 1, he has heard word that the walls were still in disarray, the walls were still in ruins, the gates had been burned with fire. This happened 150 years before, and now the people of Judah have actually been back in Jerusalem for 90 years, and the walls are still in ruins. And Nehemiah is disheartened. I mean, he is heartbroken to hear of all the ruin and devastation that is still there in Jerusalem. And he's the cupbearer of the king, as we learned in chapter 1. And being in that position, he was never to put on a frown. He was never to have a sad countenance as he entered into the presence of the king, because the king is to always be made happy. He's always to be in the presence of those who would bring him joy and gladness. And for his cupbearer, this man who would be his number one counselor, for him to come into the presence of the king with a sad countenance could cost him his life. The king could have just said to Nehemiah on that day, be gone with you. Be done away with you. I mean, he had the authority and the power to do that. But on that day, when Nehemiah, for the first time ever, went into the presence of the king with a sad countenance, instead of becoming angered at him, the king asked him, why are you sad? What's the matter? What's wrong with you? And gives Nehemiah the opportunity to lay out his reason for being so distraught. And it's interesting that it says there in chapter 1, you'll remember, I prayed to God and I spoke to the king. So immediately, Nehemiah sent up what I refer to as a missile prayer, and saying that prayer in his spirit to God, he spoke verbally to the king, and he said, why should I not be sad because of the report I've received from my brethren about the disarray and ruin back over in Jerusalem? And amazingly, the king gives Nehemiah the opportunity, the privilege, and the liberty to leave the capital city and go back over to Jerusalem to engage in this building project. Now remember, the walls have been in ruins for 150 years. The people have been back for 90 years, and nothing has been done to rebuild the walls. This passage tells us that they accomplished the rebuilding of the walls in 52 days. That's been in ruins for all of those decades, and in 52 days, God uses Nehemiah to perform this amazing task. But he doesn't do it without opposition. From the very beginning, we've been introduced to these men, Sanballat and Tobiah, and then Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, and then Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem and the Ammonites and the Arabs and all those others that are gathered together to oppose this great work. And now that the walls have been rebuilt and everything has been done except for the hanging of the gates, the opposition is still there. As a matter of fact, the opposition is going to grow more intense in this passage than probably ever before. Nehemiah is going to face the opposition of these who come to him and want to destroy what he has now accomplished. And so they're making up all of these fabrications. They're making up all of these lies and these accusations against Nehemiah. And Nehemiah once again has to face down his opponents. I don't know how he did it. You read a passage like this, and if you're like me, like I've told you before, I let my imagination sort of run wild when I read passages of Scripture such as this, and I begin trying to put myself in Nehemiah's shoe leather, and I begin trying to figure out how I would have responded. How would I have buckled up under the pressure? I'm not sure I would have done as good of a job as Nehemiah did, because Nehemiah stood true to the test all the way through to the end of the task. And so I want us to just walk through chapter 6 and just look at this subject of how much can one person take? How much can you take when life is throwing everything it can in your direction? Well, first of all, think with me about the proposal of the opposition. In chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, it tells us now, again, about these people, these opponents who have been in opposition against Nehemiah the whole time he's been back over there leading in the rebuilding of the walls. They're once again at it. And now they're having to come up with a new, ingenious way of attacking Nehemiah because nothing they've tried up to this point has worked. Nehemiah has not been dissuaded. Nehemiah has not become discouraged. Nehemiah has not buckled under the pressure. Nehemiah has remained strong. And again, it tells us, it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, that there were no breaks in it, that Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, "Come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono." But they thought to do me harm. Now that's interesting. There's nothing threatening about that invitation. Nothing. They just send him a message and say, "Hey, let's get together." Now we can read into that, and we can suppose for a moment, it doesn't take long to rule it out, but we can suppose for a moment that maybe now, since the wall has been rebuilt, Nehemiah has accomplished the task at hand. Maybe now Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, all their enemies, have now had a change of heart. And maybe they're just thinking to themselves, well, let's just invite Nehemiah down to the plain of Ono and let's celebrate with him. Let's just throw a big feast for Nehemiah. Let's just pat him on the back. Let's have a celebration. Let's celebrate the great work that Nehemiah has done. Could have been. I mean, there's nothing there that would lead us to believe that it would be anything other than an innocent invitation. Nothing except the fact that everything they've done thus far has been in opposition to Nehemiah. And that would be a pretty good clue that they were probably up to something a little bit underhanded, wouldn't you think? And there's a little interesting phrase there at the end of verse 2. They thought to do me harm. Now, that's interesting. How does Nehemiah know that they are thinking about doing him harm? Well, they've got a track record. right? Everything they've done thus far has been to do him harm. Everything they've done has been to fight against Nehemiah tooth and nail, to try to destroy the wall while he's building the wall, to try to thwart everything God is doing through Nehemiah. So Nehemiah has pretty good reason to think that, hey, they're up to no good here. They're not wanting to celebrate any accomplishments we've made. They're wanting to do me harm. And certainly it plays out that Nehemiah was exactly right. They were out to do him harm. Nehemiah had a great deal of discernment here. But in all honesty, it doesn't take a great deal of discernment to think that someone is out to do you harm when all they've ever wanted to do is to do you harm. You ever had anybody that was just a thorn in your flesh? I mean, it might be somebody, a fellow employee you worked with for years on the same job, and every day was just agony to get through another day on the job because that one person was there and they were always there. They were always making life miserable for you. Nothing you could do ever pleased them. They were out to do you harm in some way, maybe not physical harm, but they were out to do you harm. Well, that's the way it was with Nehemiah and all of his enemies. They were out to do him harm. And I read this passage, and again I ask the question, how in the world did Nehemiah stand it? How did he put up with all that pressure? We've seen in the preceding chapters how he had to put all of these safeguards into place. We've seen in preceding chapters where Nehemiah led the workers on the wall to have a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other. They were ready to work and they were ready to fight. They were always prepared for whatever might come their way. That's why Nehemiah was successful, but it doesn't tell us how he accomplished it. Nehemiah now once again is confronted by this proposal of those who were opposing him. And Nehemiah just says, no. Oh, no, I'm not coming to, no. I am not coming down there. I am not going to leave the work on the wall to come down there and meet with you for whatever the reason you have in mind. By the way, Ono was about 20 miles from Jerusalem, so it was a pretty good trek. And I guess they thought that if we can get Nehemiah separated from the other workers on the wall, it won't be very difficult to do him harm or maybe even to take his life. And Nehemiah sees through their plot. He sees through the proposal, and he just simply says, no, I'm not going to come down. I am not going to waste your time and mine. So you'd think, okay, that's the end of the story, right? Nehemiah says no to their proposition, their proposal, and they're going to go home. They're just going to pack up, go home, and it's all going to be over. Well, no. After the proposal, we then see the persistence. The enemy's not going to give up. If you've got an enemy, chances are they're never going to give up. If they don't like you, they're going to keep coming after you. It can be a family member that doesn't like you. It can be someone on the job that doesn't care for you. It can be anybody, anywhere that just simply has no regard for you, and they make life miserable for you. They go out of their way to make life miserable for you. Nehemiah says, no, I'm not coming to Ono, and they don't give up. They send the message a second time. Then they send the second message a third time. Then they send the message a fourth time. And Nehemiah says no every time. We can learn a lesson from that. You know, I've known some people, sadly, just a few, but I've known some people that they were given the opportunity to do something the first time, and they prayed about it, sincerely prayed about it, and God gave them a clear answer, no, I do not want you to do that. And so they responded to the invitation by saying, no, I cannot do that. And yet, the people who were giving the invitation didn't give up. Just like Nehemiah's enemies, they came back again. And they would come back again and invite them to do the same thing. And instead of saying, God's already given me that answer, I've already prayed, God has already told me no, instead of saying that, they began thinking to themselves, rationalizing this thing. Well, you know, if they've come back a second time, maybe I need to rethink this. Y'all remember the story of Balaam? You remember the story of Balaam wanting to curse the people of Israel? And God tells him, don't go. Don't go. This is not my will. I do not want my people cursed. And yet, Balaam goes the first time. He says, no, I can't go. God's given me an answer. I cannot go. But then the king of Beor sends again to Balaam, and he invites him again to come and curse the people of Israel. And Balaam's problem was, instead of saying, God's already given me the answer, I cannot go, he says, well, wait a few minutes, let me go pray about this again. You see, his problem was he never should have prayed about it a second time. When God has given the answer so clearly the first time, don't ever go back and ask him the second time. I remember many years ago, this is the only time this has ever happened to me, and I hope it never happens again. But I was pastoring a church, and I had a pastor search committee come and listen to me preach. Didn't know they were coming. They had not called me ahead of time, had not asked my permission for them to come and visit with us at the church I was pastoring at the time. They just showed up. And after the service, they got up and left, didn't say anything to me. And that afternoon, later on, the chairman of that pastor search team called me and said, we'd like to meet with you. And I said to him, you know, there's a few things I didn't like about the way you went about this whole thing. Number one, you just showed up. I had no idea you were going to come today. You hadn't contacted me. You hadn't asked permission from me to come. And they said, well, we didn't want you to know we were coming because you would have prepared some candy stick message to impress us. And so we wanted to just come listen to you on a day when you're going to just preach a message you prepared for your congregation. I thought, well, that's all fine and well, but it was a very rude thing for you to do. And they said, well, we really would like to meet with you. And I said, well, I will meet with you because I'm never going to say no to something until I've been able to search it out, pray over it. And anyway, to make a really long story short, this pastor search team was convinced, absolutely, thoroughly, 100% convinced that I was the pastor for their church. I was just as strongly convinced that I was not the pastor for their church. And they met with me and they told me, we have agreed 100% among the pastor search team. You're our next pastor. And I said, well, there's a problem with that. And the chairman said, well, what's the problem? I said, well, God hasn't told me that I'm the next pastor of your church. So it doesn't go with just you telling me. I have to hear it from God. Well, again, to make a long story short, they would not leave me alone. They pestered me. They were persistent. They called me. They showed up again, even after I told them, no, I am not interested, and God has told me that I am not your next pastor. Here they are again, showing up unannounced. I meet with them again, and I tell them the same thing. I am sorry, but God has not called me to be your pastor. Now, I could have, honestly and sincerely, I could have gone back to God and said, God, maybe I missed it here somehow. Maybe I missed your voice. Maybe they're right. There's 5 of them, and there's only one of me, and they're all 100% in agreement that I'm their next pastor, and I'm a lone voice over here. I sort of feel like that's the way Nehemiah was. Nehemiah hears this invitation, come down to Ono. Oh no. Come down to Ono. Oh no. Come down to Ono. Oh no. Come down 4 times. Come on down to Ono. Oh no, I'm not coming to Ono. Nehemiah, even though he was faced with the persistence of his enemies, he remained loyal and steadfast to the Lord. Sometimes things that are presented to us might appear to be exactly what we need to do. It might be a position on the job where you're offered a promotion. Nothing wrong with that, is there? Well, for a believer in Jesus Christ, there could be something wrong with that because we honestly need to hear from God before we accept any position anywhere. Before we do anything anywhere, we need to hear from God. Nehemiah had not heard from God, and so he just simply says no 4 times. And then the 5th time, they send him a letter with some threats in it, and still Nehemiah is very consistent in his commitment to God. So the first part is the proposal. The second part is their persistence after giving the proposal 4 different times. And then the third part, the third movement in this text is the pronouncement of the opposition. Here's where it really gets tricky for Nehemiah. That pronouncement is in that letter in verses 5 and 6. Sanballat sent his servant to me as before the 5th time with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, it's reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews, now remember Geshem is one of his enemies. So Geshem's word shouldn't have much weight with Nehemiah. It's reported among the nations, and Geshem says that you and the Jews plan to rebel. Therefore, according to these rumors, you are rebuilding the wall that you may be their king. And you've also appointed prophets to proclaim concerning you at Jerusalem, saying there's a king in Judah. Now these matters will be reported to the king, so come therefore and let us consult together. Okay, he hasn't given in to their persistence on just coming down for a consultation. So now they're saying, you better come down, because if you don't come down, we're going to report this to the king. And what's the this? That Nehemiah is going to pronounce himself to be king over the land of Judah. So they're not giving up. They're not backing down. But you know what? Neither is Nehemiah giving up, and neither is Nehemiah backing down. Nehemiah is remaining true and loyal to God in doing the work that God has dispatched him to do. Now that's difficult to do sometimes. You know, I told you this morning about church I pastored where I just resigned on a Sunday night because to do anything less would make me less than a man of integrity, and I could not do that in good conscience, so I resigned the church. And I did it with perfectly good conscience before God because I knew I was standing for what is right. Now, I'll be honest with you. My wife will tell you there have been moments that I have really struggled with that decision I made. Because I've asked myself quite a few times, and this is many years ago now, but I've asked myself quite a few times, should I have stayed and fought that battle? Should I have stayed? Should I have remained there and exposed what was going on behind the scenes? Because church family didn't have a clue what was going on. It was just the leadership of the church. That's the only people who knew about this whole ordeal. I could have stayed behind, and I could have exposed this staff member for what he had done and for what he was doing. It was an ongoing thing. And yet, I felt after much, much time in prayer, I felt that the best thing I could do would be to step away, take my hands off of it, and all of it would be left on shoulders of the leadership who, up until that point, had refused to do anything about it. So I resigned, and then God opens this door for me at Springdale, as I said this morning. And I was thinking to myself, well now, and I didn't do it to force anybody's hand. I didn't do that. I did it simply because I felt God was leading me to get away from it. But as soon as I resigned, left the church, within about a month, they actually called that man as their pastor. Now, I'd like to tell you that things worked out well. But a church of over 1,500 within 1 year had a fence built around it and locks on the gates. It was closed down completely. Why? Because they would not deal with a man who was living in sin. Now, I don't say that to bring disrepute to that church or to that man, for that matter. I just want you to understand how important it is when we're faced with opposition, we have to stand for what is right. Nehemiah stood for what is right, even in the face of horrific opposition. They were persistent. Nehemiah was persistent. He stood for God. Well, now, again, you think they'd give up. Wrong. The enemy never gives up. The enemy never, ever throws in the towel and quits. So listen to what happens. Verses 10 and following. Afterward I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informer, and he said to me, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you. I said, should such a man as I flee? And who is there such as I who would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. Then I perceived that God had not seen him at all, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Wow. Conspiracy runs deep. They've actually gotten into those that worked alongside Nehemiah. They have actually convinced one of Nehemiah's workers to turn against him. This is awful. They've realized they can't fight him from without, so they're going to fight him from within. They're going to get some of his own to turn on him. So what does Nehemiah do? For this reason he was hired, verse 13, that I should be afraid and act that way in sin, so that they might have cause for an evil report, that they might reproach me. And I ain't going to fall for it. Verse 14, my God, please remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works. He just simply turns to the Lord and he says, Lord, you take care of it. I'm going to take my hands off. I'm not going to fight against them. You deal with it. And God does. God does deal with it as he always does. But you see how deep opposition will run when it's left unchecked. And again, I go back to the question I raised at the very beginning. Just how much can one person take? Now, there's nothing in the text, absolutely nothing in the text that leads us to believe that Nehemiah ever became discouraged in the work. Now, he may have, and it may just not be recorded, but there's nothing recorded of any discouragement or despondency on his part. And so the question is, how did Nehemiah stay true through all the opposition for 2.5 months while they were doing the work on the wall? Well, the text actually gives us the answer. You probably noticed it as I read through it. The text tells us that twice here in this chapter, Nehemiah prayed. Now, we've already seen Nehemiah pray several times in this book. He was obviously a man committed to communicating with God. He was a man committed to prayer. But it's interesting to note what he prayed. I want you to look back at the last words of verse 9. Now, therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. That's his prayer. Note what he didn't pray. God, how about just killing Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem and all those other guys? Why don't you just rid the earth of them? They're not even worth living. No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't even pray, Lord, remove the problem. You know, that's what we more often than not pray when we're faced with a difficulty is God, just remove the problem. You can do it. You can remove this problem. You can remove that person. At least remove them from my life. Nehemiah could have prayed that. He could have prayed, God, strike them dead, or God, get them out of the way, or whatever. But instead, Nehemiah doesn't pray anything about them. He says, Lord, strengthen my hands. Don't remove the burden. Don't remove the people. Don't remove the problem. Just give me strength to stand true. And then in verse 14, my God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. He again doesn't say, God, remove them. He says, God, just remember what they've done and reward them accordingly. The key to facing opposition in life, the key to being able to tie a knot in the end of the rope and hang on, the key to remaining steadfast and loyal and persistent in our walk with God and in our work for God is to be people of prayer, seeking God's strength so that we can face the task at hand. Again, this is a key principle for believers because more often than not, and I'm speaking for myself, more often than not, I want to pray, God, get rid of the problem. You remember in Corinthians, Paul talks about having this thorn in the flesh, and he says, I prayed 3 times that God would remove the thorn. And God said to me, no, Paul, I'm not going to remove the thorn, but I will give you grace that's sufficient for you to carry the thorn. And Paul says then, most gladly, I will rejoice in the thorn. I'll rejoice in the suffering that God has allowed me to have, knowing that that is going to work for far greater glory to God than it would if He removed the thorn. God's not promised to remove all the thorns of life that we have to face. Sometimes we suffer with them, and sometimes we suffer with them on and on and on. It's a chronic thorn. It just won't go away. Sanballat and Geshem and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and all the others that had massed themselves against Nehemiah, they weren't going away. They were going to continue to come up with ways to attack with their threats and all the other things that they've done. And yet Nehemiah stays true and steadfast because he knows how to pray. Lord, don't get rid of my enemies. Just give me the strength to face the opposition. Can I just close tonight with a few take-homes that I hope will really be taken home?